Let me recount. Mexico is one of the largest centers for narcotics-related business in the world. Mexico is still the principal transit country for cocaine entering the United States. Mexico is either a producer, refiner, or transit point for cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, and heroin.
Baltimore, for a heroin problem, has gone from one heroin addict for every 3,161 people in the 1950s to one heroin addict for every 17 people in the 1990s.
When I go home, I literally sleep in fear because I am surrounded. My block is surrounded by folks who seem to deal in drugs 24 hours a day. What we get constantly is, well, what's the government doing about the drug problem? There are no boats or planes that the people in our neighborhood own, so how are these drugs getting in the country? I must tell you that I have a lot of concerns about whether Mexico should have been certified.
We had a minuscule methamphetamine problem in this country until there was developed wide-scale distribution from these criminal organizations. To give you a sense of the growth and the explosion of that, in 1991, emergency room admissions in this country for methamphetamine were 4,900. By 1997, the emergency room admissions had gone to 17,400. To give you an example of the impact in the middle part of this country, in Des Moines, Iowa, there are now more methamphetamine arrests than there are drunken driving arrests.
Drug use is highest among our 12th graders, with more than 50% of our 12th graders having tried an illicit drug, and more than 1 in 4 labeled as current users.
And yet somehow we neglect to focus on ourselves, a good look in the mirror. If we didn't consume this stuff in such great numbers at great cost, I suggest to you there wouldn't be an operation to sell it out of Mexico and Peru and Colombia.
That never had a drug problem, now all of a sudden had a major methamphetamine problem, and they have a high school there. There's 1,600 students in that high school. Over 1/3 of those students have now tried methamphetamine. We have in the course of our investigation, found major laboratories that are run by these criminal organizations that are in and of themselves very dangerous. We find them that they build them and construct them in areas close to middle schools, in equestrian centers where young people are taking riding lessons, and all of them being driven by the heads of the criminal groups that are based in Mexico. So there are some parallels between our experience in the United States with the Mafia or La Cosa Nostra and today's syndicates in Colombia and Mexico. However, there are some differences. The amount of money that these organizations in Colombia and Mexico make, the impact on the communities and citizens of the United States, the violence and the corruption associated with these groups that we see today are nothing like we could have ever imagined in the 50s and 60s. They make the traditional organized crime or mafia in the United States look like grade school children compared to what they do.
Saturday night in Temisco, a 2-hour drive from Mexico City. Los Tucanes de Tijuana, one of Mexico's biggest bands, singing their songs of love and of narcotics.
There is a culture of admiration and close to worship of drug traffickers in some of the poorest areas of Mexico.
We cannot construct a policy of interdicting narcotics in Mexico by becoming part of a silent conspiracy where Mexico pretends to be helping interdict narcotics and we pretend to believe them.
They have not to date extradited a single Mexican national on drug-related charges. And are not the Amezcua brothers responsible for the establishment in the mainstream, the development of the major methamphetamine market in the United States?
Yes, that's correct. They are. They in a sense, were the organization that started it all.
Let me just make a comment, if I might, to you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a huge, huge problem. And that's this particular Mexican cartel, which has really developed the methamphetamine trade as we know it in the world today. And the two leaders were actually in prison. There was an extradition request. I believe it was communicated to the Mexican government. As a matter of fact, they were actually held in jail only pending resolution of the extradition request, and they were cut loose. And I find this is just devastating in terms of being able to maintain an effective battle against methamphetamine.
Very carefully avoided that.
Is the picture one of fully cooperating?
No.
Sort of close with the comments of our minority leader, who said, after reviewing the past year's record, I am compelled to disagree with the President's decision to certify Mexico as fully cooperating with our government in the fight against drugs, and that was by Mr. Gephardt.
Basis for this decision. First, as President Zedillo has acknowledged, corruption is deeply rooted in Mexican counter-drug institutions.
The head of the DEA, our lead drug-fighting agency, and I'm pleased he's here, Mr. Constantine, and we call him a cop's cop, has called the corruption in Mexico the worst criminal threat to our nation that he's ever seen in nearly 40 years of law enforcement.
There is no denial in Mexico that corruption has been a way of life.
Andres Oppenheimer is a veteran foreign correspondent for the Miami Herald, whose new book about Mexico, called Bordering on Chaos, is currently a bestseller there. And they took to the streets as the country entered its worst political crisis and economic depression in over half a century.
Corruption is a major ingredient of the economic and political collapse that Mexico has suffered over the past 2 years.
The Mexican businessmen who made fortunes from dealing with the government.
Mike, in 1991, Mexico had 2 billionaires. 3 years later, it had 24. And it ranks 4th in the world in the number of billionaires after the United States, Germany, and Japan. Mind-boggling. This is a very poor country.
Here that apart only from Cuba, Mexico is the most authoritarian state in Latin America.
I think you can find examples of corruption in the United States.
You know, this basic, we're reaching an agreement that will involve trust on both sides with a government that Freedom House would describe as you know, the equivalent, a little bit this side of Cuba.
Mr. President, the fundamental problem in Mexico is the corruption that exists at any and all levels, even among those charged with fighting the drug.
Freedom House says of the judiciary that it is corrupt, that it is a politically controlled judiciary.
Every major criminal investigation that we've conducted and that I know of, somewhere in the investigation involves a corrupt law enforcement official or systemic corruption.
And they're obviously saying to the world and to the people of Mexico, we will not tolerate corruption if we can find it and root it out, even if it's at the highest levels.
At a high-level meeting with the U.S. drug czar, Secretary Gurria introduced his new chief of drug enforcement, General Gutierrez Rebollo.
We also are delighted to meet for the first time General Gutierrez Rebollo. We know his reputation for focus, for integrity.
But the U.S. endorsement became an embarrassment when it was revealed that Gutierrez Rebollo was in the pay of the drug cartels. Not just a crook. According to sources in the FBI and DEA, Before he was uncovered, General Gutierrez Rebollo had betrayed high-level informants who paid with their lives. But the evidence of high-level corruption keeps mounting. Like this Deputy Attorney General for Narcotics during the Salinas regime, who, it turns out, was in the pay of the drug cartels at the rate of $1.5 million a month.
Barry McCaffrey, the man in charge of controlling drugs and stopping the flow into the United States for Bill Clinton, once told a Mexican audience that there were really no borders between the United States and Mexico.